Imagine a room where the air smells faintly of iron and something far fouler, a place no one alive should ever enter. Behind a false wall, hidden for decades, a leather-bound journal rests, its pages brittle with age, yet each word drips with the calculated cruelty of a man who saw life as material, something to dissect, rearrange, and discard. You were never meant to hear this story, and yet, here it begins, because there are truths too disturbing to ignore. 47 human beings, 47 lives taken in pursuit of a single obsession, and not one survived. They were enslaved, invisible to a society that claimed morality, yet indispensable for a horror meticulously designed to test the limits of human endurance. This was Charleston County, South Carolina, in the years between 1847 and 1851, a place where wealth and brutality intertwined so completely that cruelty became invisible behind manners, polite conversation, and plantation gates. Dr. Silas Thornwell arrived there as a man of outward respectability, carrying credentials from Edinburgh, letters of introduction from London, and a wealth inherited from textiles. But his wealth was not meant to cultivate the land. It was meant to cultivate something far darker, experiments that violated every instinct of decency, every moral boundary, every whisper of conscience. He built his laboratory within a plantation, transforming an overseer's cottage into a surgical theater with iron restraints embedded in the floors and ceilings, recovery beds strapped with leather, and pens for live animals that would soon become unwilling donors. The construction was precise, cold, almost ritualistic, as though the architecture itself were a mechanism for terror. Those who lived under him, enslaved men and women, sensed the danger immediately. Danina, a healer born on the plantation, saw it in the quiet way he watched, in the obsession with his notes in the night lamp glow behind closed doors. She recognized the predator beneath the doctor's calm exterior, a man who looked at her, as though she were already dead, waiting only for his instruments to finish what he had planned. And yet, even as fear gripped the community, there was no one to warn, no one to stop him, and no system to check his growing obsession. Authority was absolute, and in that darkness, human life had no defense. Tonight, I'm pulling you down into that shadowed theater. Every detail you hear is drawn from the meticulous record of cruelty itself. I want you to feel it. The quiet dread, the unnatural precision, the cold intellect applied to human suffering. You are stepping across a line that most of humanity cannot even imagine. But pay attention, because once you see what happens behind these walls, nothing about the world you trusted will feel safe or real again. By the end of 1846, Belmont Plantation had ceased to be a farm. Its fields still existed, yes, but they were merely a stage for what Thornwell truly sought: total control over life itself. The overseer, Virgil Raburn, was given orders that seemed ordinary on the surface: maintain the grounds, care for animals, but each command hid a deeper, more sinister purpose. Thornwell's surgical theater was complete, a place where flesh would be studied, dissected, and replaced, where the human body became nothing more than a laboratory specimen. The animals he purchased, pigs, sheep, a young chimpanzee, were not companions. They were raw material for his obsession, carefully selected for their health and vigor, ready to provide organs to bodies that were still very much alive. Thornwell did not simply experiment. He orchestrated a theater of terror. He observed his subjects, noting weaknesses, tracking pulses, diagnosing imaginary diseases, and recording every detail with the precision of a watchmaker. The enslaved people understood the unspoken pattern. Fear was thick in the quarters. They watched their neighbors disappear under the guise of treatment, escorted to the medical building, and never returned. Rumors were whispered behind closed doors, but no one dared to confront the truth openly. To do so would be to invite death, not just for oneself, but for one's family. This was a system designed not only to violate bodies, but to crush spirits, to instill a helpless obedience before the instruments of power. The first selection was a man named Augustus. He was 31, showing only a persistent cough, still strong, still alive in the ordinary sense. Thornwell chose him with deliberate calculation, knowing that outward health was the perfect disguise. He sedated him under the pretense of treatment, using whiskey mixed with mild chemicals to dull resistance, and bound him to the table in the center of that iron-clad theater. In those moments, every instinct of survival failed Augustus. He was already caught in a trap designed by someone who understood not just anatomy, but fear itself. As the procedure began, Thornwell moved with meticulous attention, his journal open, recording times, techniques, and theoretical expectations. The surgery defied the understanding of the era, or any era. Organs from animals were grafted, transplanted, forcibly integrated, yet the human body rejected them immediately. Blood flowed, tissues tore, life ebbed, and yet Thornwell's notes remained clinical, detached, almost proud. He marked failure but also potential. Each death was not a tragedy to him, it was data, proof that the methodology might succeed with refinement. Outside, the enslaved community was paralyzed. Danina, who had sensed this horror from the very beginning, knew the truth before anyone else. The sounds carried to the quarters, muffled and unnatural, neither screams nor silence. By dawn, Augustus was buried in an unmarked grave. The first warning had come and gone, yet no one could act. Fear had already begun its slow, suffocating work, embedding itself into every glance, every hesitation, every silent step taken across the plantation. Pearl was 26, a woman whose outward health masked the fragility Thornwell sought. He had been watching her for weeks, noting the irregular rhythm of her heart, the subtle fatigue in her steps. To the outside world, she was just another enslaved person, performing daily labor with quiet endurance. To Thornwell, she was raw material, a living experiment waiting for his intervention. The approach was the same as with Augustus. Sedation through deception, restraint under the guise of treatment. But with one key adjustment. Thornwell had learned from his first failure. He believed a partial transplant, supplementing rather than replacing an organ, might reduce immediate fatality. On the night Pearl was taken, the plantation was silent. The enslaved people had learned that the theater of horror came without warning, and any sound from the medical building was a signal to withdraw, to watch from shadowed corners and pray invisibly. Pearl's procedure was executed with methodical precision. A lamb's heart tissue was grafted to strengthen her weakened organ. Thornwell's hands moved with confidence, his eyes scanning the subtle reactions of her body. Each pulse, each breath, each tremor documented in his journal. Hours passed. Pearl endured longer than Augustus. 6 hours of unbearable trauma, 6 hours in which life and death danced a grotesque waltz orchestrated by a man who treated suffering as curiosity. When Pearl finally succumbed, hemorrhaging and cardiac failure claimed her life. The outcome was the same as before: another unmarked grave, another life erased quietly before dawn. Thornwell's journal entry was clinical, detached, almost congratulatory in tone, noting method refinements for future subjects. The pattern was becoming frighteningly systematic: selection, sedative deception, restraint, surgical manipulation, inevitable death, burial. Each death was stripped of identity, numbered and recorded as though humanity was irrelevant to the process. Meanwhile, the enslaved community was transforming under the weight of terror. Children were coached to appear healthy. Adults refused to report illnesses. A single cough could mark you for death. Danina's fears had been validated, yet even her knowledge of herbs and remedies offered no protection. Thornwell's reach extended through manipulation, through wealth, through control of life itself. Obedience was compulsory, submission was survival. Resistance was a sentence. The theater of horror expanded with each passing procedure. Thornwell's obsession grew, not just with the experiments, but with the psychological dominance they imposed. He had discovered that fear could be quantified, measured, and optimized, just like tissue grafts. The enslaved people were not only subjects. They were instruments for refining terror, for perfecting the discipline of obedience, for embedding helplessness deep into the human psyche. Every glance, every whispered rumor, every shadowed observation fed Thornwell's sense of power. His conviction that life itself could be molded, manipulated, and perfected in his image of experimentation. By March of 1847, Thornwell's experiments had evolved into a rhythm. As terrifying as it was methodical, each new subject brought him closer to understanding, or so he believed, the mysterious interface between human and animal anatomy. The procedures became increasingly complex. Kidneys, portions of liver, even segments of lungs were forcibly integrated into unwilling bodies. No anesthesia, no understanding of infection control, no preparation for the body's inevitable rejection. Every operation was a controlled apocalypse, measured in hours of suffering, hemorrhaging, and the slow extinguishing of life. He treated death not as tragedy, but as a waypoint, each corpse a step closer to his theoretical mastery. The psychological manipulation of the community was equally deliberate. Thornwell's wealth, his social standing, and the veneer of medical legitimacy ensured silence. The enslaved men and women understood instinctively protest, resistance, or escape were all pathways to death. The disappearance of neighbors became normalized, explained away by supposed illnesses or accidents, while the reality, horrific, unimaginable, was whispered in hushed tones among the quarters. Denina, whose insight had once served to protect her people, now found herself powerless. Even her presence as healer, her knowledge, her attempts to maintain dignity, marked her as a potential subject. Observation alone, she realized, was no protection, it was a selection criterion. The selections became more precise. Thornwell identified patterns of vulnerability, youth, subtle illness, resilience, that he believed might maximize the likelihood of organ integration. He numbered his subjects, stripping them of identity, reducing them to data points in a ledger of suffering. Each procedure was meticulously documented: time, organ source, techniques attempted, post-operative survival duration. Failures were analyzed clinically, successes, always fleeting, were celebrated as proof of method. There was no compassion, no hesitation, no remorse. Even the animals used as donors were carefully chosen for their health, their vitality, their suitability for harvesting. The line between human and beast blurred under the lens of Thornwell's obsession. In the quarters, fear took root in a new way. Children were instructed to hide symptoms. Parents learned to mask weakness, to coach compliance. Denina understood that survival required a form of self, erasure, act invisible, act compliant, act as though nothing had changed. The terror was psychological as much as physical, a system of control that extended beyond the surgical theater into every corner of the plantation. The pattern was unmistakable, power was absolute, suffering was optimized, obedience was enforced, and life itself was disposable. Every detail, every observation, every act of cruelty was a lesson in control. Thornwell was no ordinary man obsessed with science. He was a manipulator of minds, a master of fear, a silent orchestrator of terror. The plantation's silence was his ally. Behind the polite society of Charleston, behind church hymns and social gatherings, a dark experiment in human domination was unfolding. A system built not only to challenge anatomy, but to dominate spirit, to bend humanity itself into submission. Denina knew long before anyone else that survival on Belmont Plantation required more than obedience. It demanded perception, cunning, and the careful calculation of risk. She had spent decades reading the intentions behind every glance, every gesture, every order from those who held power over life and death. But Thornwell was different. He did not simply command, he observed. He cataloged. He waited. Her intuition told her that resistance in the traditional sense would be fatal. Every movement, every word, every interaction had to be measured against the invisible scale of his scrutiny. The enslaved people around her were beginning to understand this instinctively too. A cough, a pale face, a hesitant step, any sign of weakness could mark you for selection. Clara, Danina's daughter, was young, pregnant, and unaware of the full weight of her mother's foresight. Yet even she felt the tension, the suffocating dread that clung to the quarters. Danina began to teach her, quietly, through gestures, coded words, and hidden notes, how to move without drawing attention, how to mask pain, how to preserve knowledge that Thornwell would never want preserved. It was dangerous work. The smallest slip could result in immediate selection, but Danina understood that knowledge was power, and that in a place ruled by terror, even a sliver of power could save lives. Thornwell's focus, meanwhile, sharpened with every death. He had begun to refine his criteria, selecting subjects based on subtle indicators of vulnerability and resilience. Those he chose were never the visibly sick. They were young, strong, and vital enough to offer the illusion of potential success. The precision of his observation was staggering. He tracked respiration, pulse, dietary habits, and even behavioral quirks, recording everything in the leather-bound journal that would later chill the world to its core. Each entry was clinical, detached, yet beneath the surface lay an obsessive fascination with control, with domination over the very essence of life. When Danina was finally summoned, she walked to the surgical theater with a calm that belied the storm within. She embraced Clara one last time, whispering instructions about hidden herbs, hidden remedies, and knowledge meant to endure beyond her death. Her defiance was quiet, invisible, a preservation of legacy in the face of annihilation. In those moments, she became more than a victim. She became a beacon, a silent resistance embedded in the memory and survival of her daughter. It was here, at the intersection of terror and awareness, that the first real cracks appeared in Thornwell's system. Fear could control bodies, but knowledge could survive. The enslaved community began to understand that survival required more than submission. It required observation, adaptation, and the cultivation of invisible power. And as Danina faced the inevitability of her fate, the hidden network of awareness she had nurtured promised that some truths, some fragments of resistance, would endure long after the surgical theater had claimed yet another life. Thornwell's mind was a precision instrument hunned by obsession. Each procedure was not just surgery. It was an experiment in domination, a test of his ability to bend life itself to his will. In the quiet of the surgical theater, illuminated by lamplight that reflected off iron restraints and polished instruments, he moved with a methodical detachment. The bodies on the tables were not human to him. They were data points, variables in an equation only he could comprehend. 47 would be tested, 47 would fail, and each failure refined the methodology, sharpened his understanding of how life could be manipulated, how pain could be optimized, how obedience could be extracted through fear. He calculated every detail. How long sedation would last, how much force was needed to restrain struggling limbs, how to integrate tissue from animals with minimal immediate rejection, even though he understood nothing of the immune system. Each note in his journal was clinical, precise, and chillingly devoid of empathy. Timestamps, observations, organ sources, techniques attempted, every detail was a record of power. Even failure was proof of progress, each death a lesson in control. The human body, under his gaze, became a canvas upon which he could experiment without moral constraint. Yet it was not just anatomy he mastered. It was psychology. He understood instinctively that terror could be as binding as straps and iron beams. The enslaved community learned quickly that the theater of horror was unpredictable, that life itself could be taken in the guise of treatment. Rumors spread quietly, whispered in corners and shadows. Parents coached children to hide illness. Friends feigned health. Everyone learned to move invisibly, to speak cautiously, to anticipate the unseen selection. Fear became systemic. a web that Thornwell did not merely exploit, he orchestrated. It was a quiet, pervasive domination, as lethal as the surgical knife. Even among his victims, patterns emerged. Youth and apparent vigor were no protection. Denina, Augustus, Piril, each had been chosen for qualities that suggested potential, only to have life extinguished by cold precision. Thornwell's obsession with refinement grew with every operation. He varied species, tissues, techniques. Pigs, lambs, even chimpanzees were selected for grafting. His hypothesis was clear: a methodical approach, applied relentlessly, could eventually achieve what no one had dared attempt. And in this, he merged ambition with cruelty, intellect with sadism, and science with terror. By the time Thornwell reviewed the results of multiple experiments, he no longer viewed the deaths as failures. They were stepping stones, evidence that human limits could be probed, measured, and extended, that power could be absolute when wielded with knowledge, obsession, and total disregard for morality. In this dark calculus, he became more than a doctor. He became the master of life and death, the architect of suffering, and the quiet terror looming over every heartbeat in the quarters beyond the surgical theater. The enslaved community at Belmont Plantation existed in a state of suspended terror, each day measured not by sunlight or seasons, but by the invisible pattern of Thornwell's selection. They had learned quickly: the slightest sign of weakness, a pale face, a cough, even a subtle hesitation, could mark someone for the surgical theater. Survival depended on invisibility, on the careful masking of every natural signal of human frailty. Parents coached children, elders whispered instructions, and the community began to communicate in gestures, glances, and coded words. Knowledge became both armor and weapon, an invisible network of awareness that Thornwell could not see, yet which pulsed quietly beneath his shadow of control. Denina's insight became a lifeline. She taught Clara, and a few trusted others, the subtle ways to conceal illness, to appear compliant, and to preserve fragments of knowledge about herbs, remedies, and the body itself. These lessons were whispered in the dark, folded into daily routines, passed along without detection. Each act of quiet preservation was a defiance of Thornwell's system, a way to survive mentally even as physical survival seemed impossible. The tension was unbearable. Every knock at the door, every call to the medical building, could mean a person would never return. Yet, within this fear, resilience began to take root. Even Thornwell, in his obsession, could not entirely suppress the instincts of the enslaved. Observing him from the quarters, they began to notice patterns, rituals in his behavior, the timing of selections, the movement of animals. Denina, especially, saw the rhythms that governed his madness and began using them to anticipate danger, to protect those she could. Every whispered warning, every hidden remedy, became a lifeline threaded through the terror. They were learning not just to survive, but to resist invisibly, using knowledge and foresight as shields against a man who believed he controlled everything. This tension, fear mingled with the subtle assertion of agency, created a psychological battlefield. Thornwell wielded terror like a scalpel, precise and surgical, yet the enslaved community wielded awareness as a countermeasure. Survival became an intricate dance, each movement calculated, each interaction weighed against invisible stakes. Every day, they practiced the art of disappearing while remaining present, of concealing life while appearing compliant. The psychological weight was immense. Eyes darted at lamplight flickers behind the surgical theater, ears strained for any sound from the iron-clad building, and hearts beat in measured silence. Thornwell had created a system of terror that extended far beyond his surgical experiments. He had weaponized fear itself, embedding it into the daily lives of those he had not yet selected. And yet, within that darkness, the first flickers of quiet rebellion, invisible and untraceable, began to emerge. The enslaved had begun to fight in ways Thornwell could not measure, could not record, could not ever hope to control. As spring of 1847 gave way to summer, Thornwell's procedures grew more audacious, more intricate, and increasingly grotesque. The initial attempts with lungs and hearts had failed, yet he refined his techniques, varying species, organs, and combinations, each experiment a lesson in suffering and control. Sheep lung tissue, pig liver segments, pieces of animal stomach, all were tested on human bodies in a theater illuminated by lamplight that flickered over iron restraints and polished surgical tools. Time itself became measured in agony. Hours of life stretched thin by the precision of his obsession. He was no longer merely performing surgeries. He was orchestrating the systematic domination of the body, the mind, and the spirit. The psychological toll on the community intensified. The invisible network of awareness, built by Danina and a few trusted others, became a shield against total despair. Yet fear had a rhythm, a pulse, and Thornwell's selections dictated that rhythm. Each disappearance, each death, reinforced the invisible chains he had cast over every heartbeat on the plantation. The enslaved learned to hide symptoms with ruthless efficiency, to speak in veiled warnings, to observe the doctor and anticipate his moves. The theater of terror extended beyond the surgical building into every shadow, every quiet corner of the quarters. Fear itself had become a tool, sharpened and wielded with surgical precision. By now, Thornwell had begun to number his subjects rather than name them, as if erasing identity could somehow ease the abstraction of his crimes. Subject 10, 11, 12. The human became data, a measure of progress, a vessel for experimentation. Each procedure was documented meticulously in the leather-bound journal, detailing times, techniques, organ sources, and theoretical observations. Failures were dissected as if they were mechanical errors. Successes, fleeting though they might be, were celebrated as proof of method. The line between man and animal, between life and experiment, blurred into an indistinguishable shadow under the lens of his obsession. It was in this period, amid mounting horror, that Danina and Clara began to develop the first subtle acts of resistance. They whispered a symbolic phrase to each other, an affirmation of identity, survival, and the invisible power of knowledge, ashes of the unseen. They repeated it twice, carefully, committing it to memory, embedding it into their consciousness. In doing so, they transformed terror into a quiet assertion of self, a mental lock against complete domination, a signal to themselves and each other, that even in the depths of horror, some things could not be stolen. The symbolic phrase was more than words. It was a talisman of awareness, a weapon against invisibility, a refusal to surrender entirely to the machinery of fear. Thornwell controlled bodies, but he could not control minds, at least not those trained to see through the shadows, to survive invisibly, to carry knowledge that death could not touch. Thornwell's experiments had reached a new level of precision and cruelty. The initial procedures with lungs and hearts had failed, but he refused to see them as defeat. Each death was catalogued meticulously, every organ rejection noted as data, every hemorrhage measured in minutes and seconds. By mid-1847, his methodology had evolved into something ritualistic, a sequence of selection, sedation, restraint, surgical intrusion, and inevitable death. There was no room for empathy, no consideration for humanity, only the cold calculus of experimentation and power. His journal became a ledger of obsession, the pages filled with clinical language that concealed a monstrous intent. And yet, beneath the sterile terminology, the horror was unmistakable. Subjects were no longer selected solely for their perceived vulnerability. Thornwell now sought optimal variables, those whose bodies could, theoretically, withstand the trauma long enough to yield useful data. Pigs, lambs, and other livestock were chosen for vitality, size, and compatibility, as though life itself could be dissected and engineered to his specifications. By attempting integration of organs like liver, kidney, and stomach tissue, he pushed the boundaries of medical understanding far beyond the knowledge of his era. Infection, tissue rejection, hemorrhage. These were not obstacles but variables to be cataloged and refined. Every death brought him closer to some ideal, some hypothetical mastery of life that no one else could comprehend. The terror imposed on the enslaved community intensified with each passing procedure. Danina's network of coded communication expanded, but fear remained a constant weight. Every selection, every disappearance, served as a reminder that survival depended on invisibility. Children were coached to suppress signs of illness. Adults moved through their routines with painstaking vigilance, hiding weakness and masking suffering. Even as they adapted, the psychological manipulation was relentless. Thornwell's control was not only physical but mental, his presence a constant, suffocating reminder of who held life and death in their hands. And yet, in the darkest corners, the first seeds of silent rebellion persisted. The symbolic phrase, "Ashes of the unseen," became a whispered mantra, repeated to reinforce identity, resilience, and the invisible network of power that Thornwell could not measure. Repeating it twice was a ritual of mental defense, a commitment to preserve awareness and agency despite the overwhelming machinery of terror. These quiet acts were invisible to him, yet potent. They sustained hope, cultivated survival instincts, and maintained knowledge that might, one day, serve as resistance. Thornwell believed himself omnipotent. In his mind, precision, wealth, and terror equated to absolute control. He could manipulate bodies, orchestrate death, and enforce obedience, but he had not anticipated the quiet endurance of the human mind. In every whispered phrase, every hidden action, the enslaved reminded themselves, and the world yet to come, that no amount of cruelty could fully extinguish the spark of awareness, the seed of rebellion. By the summer of 1847. Thornwell's obsession had evolved beyond mere experimentation. He had entered the realm of obsessional refinement, where precision, cruelty, and calculation fused into a singular, terrifying purpose. The earlier attempts with lungs, hearts, and stomach tissue had yielded predictable failure, but he saw opportunity in every death. Each body was a template, every hemorrhage and rejection a lesson, every failed graft a step closer to what he believed was mastery over life itself. He began to push limits, attempting multi-organ grafts, combining tissues from pigs, lambs, and even the young chimpanzee he had acquired months earlier. In his journal, the entries became longer, more meticulous, clinical yet chillingly obsessive. He recorded temperatures, pulses, timing, and physiological reactions with a detachment that belied the horror unfolding in the theater. The enslaved community watched from the shadows, terror escalating with each new procedure. By now, the rhythm of selection was predictable, but knowing the pattern did not mitigate dread. It only sharpened it. Children were coached with greater precision to mask symptoms. Adults developed subtle signals to warn one another of impending danger. Danina, whose foresight had once been instinctual, now operated with deliberate strategy, instructing Clara and a few trusted others on how to preserve knowledge, maintain invisibility, and survive encounters with Thornwell's authority. Every whispered message, every hidden note of medicinal knowledge, became an act of defiance, a counterweight to the overwhelming control of the plantation. Thornwell's methodology grew more calculated. He no longer relied solely on physical weakness. He sought ideal subjects, those who combined youth, resilience, and specific physiological traits he believed might allow the animal tissue to integrate more successfully. He numbered them. Subject 13, 14, 15, erasing identity to maintain clinical distance. In his eyes, individuality was a variable, not a human life. By mid-procedure, he was attempting multi-organ grafts, kidney and liver combinations, stomach and heart, tissues from multiple species in a single body. The surgeries were long, brutal, and inevitably fatal. Yet every failure was documented as refinement, each death a lesson in technique, a step toward the theoretical perfection he imagined. Amid this escalating horror, The symbolic phrase persisted. Danina and Clara repeated it twice daily, quietly embedding it into memory, a ritual that reaffirmed identity, agency, and survival. Ashes of the unseen. The repetition was not a comfort. It was a psychological weapon, a subtle rebellion against the machinery of terror Thornwell had built. It reinforced awareness in a world designed to erase it, a mental anchor in the face of relentless control. In this crucible of obsession and fear, Thornwell's dominance over bodies was nearly absolute. But the enslaved had discovered a subtle, invisible power. He could not control awareness, foresight, and the quimundable will to survive. By late 1847, Thornwell's obsession had begun to consume him as fully as it consumed his subjects. The surgical theater, once a place of detached calculation, now seemed to pulse with a life of its own, a reflection of his own increasingly fractured mind. He moved with an intensity bordering on mania, measuring every breath, every pulse, every involuntary movement, as though the human body were a machine he could master with sheer will. His journal entries grew longer, more obsessive, littered with minute observations, diagrams, and theoretical musings that edged into mania. He no longer simply cataloged failure. He argued with it, reasoned with it, as if the bodies themselves resisted him on some subconscious level. Each procedure escalated in complexity. Multi-organ grafts were attempted with a precision that defied the medical knowledge of the era, yet they ended predictably in death. Blood loss, hemorrhage, infection, and shock became constants, but Thornwell treated them as data points, ignoring the humanity of the victims entirely. Subject after subject, often numbered rather than named, disappeared beneath his hands, buried quietly before dawn in unmarked graves. In the quarters, whispers of horror intensified, but they were carefully controlled. The enslaved learned to anticipate danger, to camouflage illness, and to communicate subtle warnings. Even under this suffocating terror, they cultivated a network of invisible resistance. The psychological tension became almost unbearable. Thornwell's presence was omnipresent, his obsession so evident that it radiated outward, infecting the very air of Belmont Plantation. Fear, already a tool of control, now fed the theater of madness he had created. Danina and Clara understood that survival required absolute vigilance, not just of body, but of mind. The symbolic phrase, ashes of the unseen, repeated twice each day, became a ritual of mental fortification, a quiet assertion of agency that Thornwell could neither observe nor suppress. It was their shield against the relentless erosion of humanity that the doctor enforced with surgical precision. And yet, cracks were beginning to show in Thornwell himself. His detachment from the human cost of his experiments was no longer absolute. In quiet moments, the weight of failure, the repeated confrontations with death, pressed on him in subtle ways. Still, he could not stop, could not slow his hand. Each death was a lesson, each failure a challenge, each scream a muffled, unheeded sound, fueling his compulsion to push further, faster, deeper. His obsession had become a self-perpetuating machine, feeding both terror and experimentation, and threatening to consume him entirely in the process. In these shadows, the theater of horror had become a mirror. The enslaved learned to survive with awareness and subtle defiance, and the doctor, once confident in his dominion, was beginning to feel the first tremors of his own unraveling. By the winter of 1847, Thornwell's experiments had become almost ritualistic, a grim choreography of suffering and precision. Each new subject was selected with calculated intent, strength, youth, resilience, all measured against the theoretical compatibility of animal organs. The procedures escalated in complexity, now combining liver, kidney, heart, and lung tissue in ways that no contemporary surgeon could have imagined attempting. Each surgery stretched across hours, the body racked by bleeding, rejection, and shock. Yet Thornwell recorded every detail with unwavering detachment, cataloging failure as progress, cruelty as methodology, and death as data. He believed that mastery over life itself was just beyond the next incision, the next graft, the next impossible experiment. For the enslaved community, terror had reached a suffocating intensity. The surgical theater's shadow fell over every corner of Belmont, a reminder that life was provisional, subject to the whims of one man's obsession. Children were taught to suppress coughs, to mask fatigue, to hide signs of illness that might draw Thornwell's attention. Adults moved with calculated precision, masking fear, hiding knowledge, and preserving vital information in secret. Denina, Clara, and a few trusted others had become custodians of hidden wisdom, carrying the legacy of survival through whispered instructions, concealed remedies, and the symbolic phrase, "Ashes of the unseen," repeated twice daily. It became a mental talisman, a reinforcement of identity and agency, an invisible weapon against the machinery of terror. The psychological impact of these experiments was almost as brutal as the physical toll. Thornwell's presence was omnipresent, his obsessive scrutiny radiating outward like a virus, infecting the air, the routine, the very rhythm of daily life. Fear became internalized, shaping behavior, dictating actions, embedding itself in the psyche of every witness. Survival required constant awareness, and yet the constant tension threatened to fracture even the most resilient minds. Every knock at the door, every summons to the medical building, was a reminder that life and death were arbitrary, subject to the whims of precision and obsession. Thornwell himself began to mirror the terror he inflicted. His obsession had begun to consume him entirely. Sleep became unnecessary, reflection became obsession, empathy had been stripped from him long ago. The failures that once fed his resolve now pressed on him subtly, like shadows at the edge of perception. Yet he could not and would not pause. Each death, each rejection, each hemorrhage was a step toward a theoretical mastery of life, an impossible perfection that justified every act of cruelty. In this relentless descent, Belmont Plantation had transformed into a crucible of terror and control. Where human lives were instruments, fear was currency, and survival required mastery of invisibility. By early 1848, the weight of terror at Belmont Plantation had reached a threshold where fear and resistance coexisted in a delicate, dangerous balance. The pattern of selection, the unrelenting experimentation, and Thornwell's omnipresent gaze had instilled a pervasive dread, yet it had also forged a subtle resilience. The enslaved had learned to anticipate his moves, to hide weakness with near-perfect control, to communicate warnings through invisible signals. Denina and Clara had become quiet strategists, their knowledge and foresight transforming into acts of invisible defiance. Every whispered word, every concealed herb, every coded glance became a thread in a network Thornwell could neither see nor control. The surgical theater, where 47 lives would ultimately vanish, had become a stage for both obsession and subtle rebellion. Thornwell's experiments were now increasingly grotesque in ambition, multi-organ grafts, combinations of pig, lamb, and primate tissue. But his clinical detachment could not extinguish the small acts of resistance that pulsed through the quarters. The enslaved, in their silence, had begun to exert an influence over the pace of terror. They feigned health, disguised fatigue, and manipulated daily routines, forcing the doctor's calculations to navigate unpredictability. Every act of survival was a challenge to his supposed omnipotence, a quiet assertion that while he controlled bodies, he could not entirely control minds. It was during this period that Denina and Clara took a subtle but decisive step. Recognizing that survival required more than concealment, they began instructing a select few in the repetition of the symbolic phrase, "Ashes of the unseen," not once, but twice, embedding it as a ritual into consciousness. This act was transformative. It was not merely a mental defense, it was a declaration of invisible identity, a quiet reclamation of power within a system designed to erase agency. Each repetition reinforced focus, memory, and awareness, embedding a seed of resilience that would persist even in the face of terror. Thornwell, oblivious to these maneuvers, continued his escalating experiments. Each procedure was more complex than the last, more audacious, and yet, ironically, less certain. The human variables he so meticulously measured could no longer be entirely controlled, for the enslaved had learned to manipulate their appearances, their behaviors, and even their responses to the sedatives and treatments he employed. His obsession with refinement now collided with unpredictability, a psychological tension that had begun to unsettle even him, though he would never acknowledge it. In this crucible, terror and resilience existed side by side, a collision of control and subtle defiance. Belmont was no longer just a theater of horror. It had become a battlefield of invisible power, where the enslaved had discovered that even in the shadow of absolute domination, consciousness, strategy, and subtle ritual could preserve fragments of humanity. By mid-1848, Thornwell's obsession had grown into something approaching mania. The surgical theater, once a place of precise experimentation, now seemed to him a universe over which he held absolute dominion. Yet cracks were beginning to appear. His calculations, meticulous as they were, could no longer guarantee control. The human subjects he selected, numbered, depersonalized, treated as mere variables, were unpredictable in ways he had not accounted for. The enslaved had mastered subtle deception, hiding weakness, feigning compliance, manipulating appearances. They moved within the parameters of survival, invisible yet aware, silently undermining the dominion Thornwell believed was absolute. His experiments had escalated in complexity, now involving multi-organ grafts from pigs, lambs, and primates in combinations that defied medical logic. The procedures were lengthy, excruciating, and always fatal, yet Thornwell's obsession drove him onward. He noted every hemorrhage, every rejection, every subtle physiological response in the leather-bound journal, treating death as data, suffering as method, and terror as both tool and subject. The precision of his work masked the horror it inflicted, but beneath the clinical veneer lay an undeniable madness, a mind consumed by the illusion of control. The enslaved community, however, had begun to exploit this obsession. Denina Clarara and a handful of trusted others had developed a network of silent communication, subtle signals, and coded warnings. They repeated the symbolic phrase, "Ashes of the unseen," twice daily, embedding it as ritual, as a mental shield against the encroaching machinery of terror. This ritual was more than survival. It was a psychological reclamation of power, an affirmation of identity in a world designed to erase it. Thornwell could manipulate bodies. He could orchestrate suffering, but he could not infiltrate the minds of those who had cultivated awareness, foresight, and subtle defiance. The psychological pressure of the unfolding chaos began to show even in Thornwell. His obsession became erratic, his precision tinged with frustration at the unpredictability of human variables. Each death was catalogued, yet each failure chipped at the illusion of omnipotence. The boundaries between control and chaos blurred, and the psychological weight of his own system of terror began to erode the stability of the man himself. He was no longer merely experimenting on bodies. He was battling an invisible resistance, one that his terror could not fully suppress. Belmont Plantation had transformed into a crucible where fear, control, and subtle rebellion collided. The surgical theater had become a battleground of the mind as much as the body. Thornwell's obsession drove horror, but the quiet rituals of survival, the repeated phrases, the hidden knowledge, the invisible resistance, ensured that even in the shadow of death, the enslaved retained fragments of agency, awareness, and unbroken humanity. The final months of Thornwell's tenure at Belmont Plantation were marked by an intensity that bordered on frenzy. His experiments, now grotesque amalgamations of human and animal tissue, had pushed beyond any medical understanding of the era, yet failure remained constant. Every graft, every organ transplant, Every attempt at merging disparate biological systems ended in the same way: death. And with each death, Thornwell's obsession deepened. He recorded the outcomes with unflinching precision, noting the exact time of demise, the physiological breakdowns, the subtle reactions that he interpreted as lessons. The leather-bound journal, already a repository of horror, grew heavier with the weight of his ambition and cruelty. Yet Thornwell's perceived omnipotence was unraveling. The enslaved community, long trapped in terror, had perfected the art of survival. Denina's teachings, Clarara's guidance, and the symbolic phrase, "a shiz of the unseen," had become tools of invisible resistance. Repeated twice daily, it reinforced awareness, cultivated resilience, and preserved identity against the machinery of control. The network of subtle signals, concealed warnings, and hidden knowledge ensured that Thornwell's tyranny, for all its precision and obsession, could never fully dominate the human spirit. While bodies fell on the surgical tables, minds remained defiant, vigilant, and unbroken. Thornwell's own psychological state reflected the tension between obsession and failure. He had calculated, controlled, and measured everything, yet human unpredictability, the very element he believed he could dominate, continued to elude him. Each unexpected reaction, each concealed sign of resistance, chipped away at his illusion of total control. His obsession had become a double-edged sword, fueling the horror he inflicted while simultaneously exposing his vulnerability to chaos. The meticulous order of his experiments existed in constant collision with the hidden patterns of survival and defiance he could not perceive. When the journal was discovered decades later, hidden behind a false wall after the Charleston fire of 1891, the world glimpsed the full scale of Belmont's horror. 47 victims, 47 meticulously recorded experiments, 0 survivors. The clinical detachment, the obsessive documentation, and the extraordinary ambition combined to reveal a story of human cruelty amplified by knowledge and obsession. Yet within that darkness, the subtle acts of invisible defiance, the whispered phrase, the hidden knowledge, the careful preservation of identity, stood as enduring proof that terror, no matter how systematic, could never fully extinguish the human will. Belmont Plantation became a testament to both extremes: the depths of obsession, cruelty, and domination, and the resilient, invisible defiance of those forced to survive under it. Thornwell sought mastery over life itself, yet in the end, it was awareness, subtlety, and the quiet assertion of identity that endured, hidden in plain sight, echoing across decades, waiting for the world to bear witness to the truths it had been forced to conceal.